Hopefully it's working. We're going to be in Job chapter 15 this evening. Starting in verse 1, I thought we'd get down through verse 13, but we're only going to get through the first 10 verses. I'll read the first 13 together here because it's a section. Then answered Eliphaz the Temanite and said, Should a wise man utter vain knowledge and fill his belly with the east wind? Should he reason with unprofitable talk, or with speeches wherewith he can do no good? Yea, thou castest off fear, and restrainest prayer before God. For thy mouth uttereth thine iniquity, and thou choosest the tongue of the crafty. Thine own mouth condemneth thee, and not I, yea, thine own lips testify against thee. Art thou the first man that was born? Or wast thou made before the hills? Hast thou heard the secret of God? And dost thou restrain wisdom to thyself? What knowest thou that we know not? What understandest thou, which is not in us? With us are both the gray-headed and very aged men, much elder than thy father. Are the consolations of God small with thee? Is there any secret thing with thee? Why doth thine heart carry thee away, and what do thy eyes wink at? That thou turnest thy spirit against God, and lettest such words go out of thy mouth. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Now, Father, tonight as we start the second round of speeches here in Job, Eliphaz is going to unload again on his friend, and that is not what people need when they are struggling and hurting. They need warmth and compassion and understanding. And even in times of rebuke, we can rebuke in love and make a difference in someone's life. We can correct in love and make a difference in someone's life. But Father, help us to learn that a proper view of you is imperative to giving out any kind of instruction or wisdom or advice. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. This second round, as we mentioned last week, starts kind of... The first round, they were just talking to each other, and they kind of unloaded on Job a little bit. But this second round, they get a little bitey with what they're saying. And when Eliphaz starts his discussion here in the first 13 verses, he starts off with a really strong rebuke. He does not like at all what Job has been saying. And so the first 3 verses are, your words are empty. Should a wise man utter vain knowledge? Vain means empty, comes to naught, and fills his belly with the east wind. He has 2 things that he wants to get across to Job here. The first one is in verse 2. He's going to compare his words to the wind. And then he is going to say in verse 3, will you argue your case with unprofitable talk? And so he's setting him up here for verse 3 with verse 2. And the 2 phrases that he uses, the 2 words, vain knowledge, now remember that this is poetry, and so if we were reading it in the poetry context, you'd get a lot of flavor from it. But what he's saying here is the vain knowledge is talk of the wind. If you were to literally translate it from the Hebrew, that's what it would mean. Talk of wind. Wind is used in a variety of ways in the Old Testament, and some of them are really worth looking up. This word's probably used close to 600 times or better in the Old Testament. Sometimes it is used for the breath of God. Sometimes it's used for the Holy Spirit, which makes sense because he is the breath of God. Sometimes it means blast of breath or blast of the nostrils. And sometimes it means wind, and a couple of times it's even, especially in Psalms and Proverbs, interpreted cool breeze. In the cool of the morning, that phrase in English is actually meaning in the cool blowing of the wind. Now there is some really interesting study there if you wanted to dive into it. If you literally looked up that Hebrew word, breath and wind, it's amazing because as you go throughout the Old Testament, when God talks about the wind, usually he talks about breathing it out. He breathed and an east wind came up. He breathed and such happened. Now scientists claim that they know that wind is caused by air movements because this pocket's colder than this pocket and this pocket's warmer than this pocket. But still, we don't really even understand wind really today. And if we did, we'd be able to forecast tornadoes and all kinds of storms a lot better than we can. But you couple these, and he's saying you have vain or empty words. They are unprofitable. They are without knowledge. There's no substance to them. Should a man talk about the science of the wind when it's so unknown and so uncertain? That's the way you could ask this of Job. In other words, he's saying, you're going on and on and on and on and on and on about God like you know him so well, and I think you're just talking about the wind, and nobody really knows how the wind works. And so all this, lofty language that you've been using in the last chapter about God is kind of like talking about the wind, because who can really refute it or back it up? It's a tough thing to do. And then the second part of the verse there, he talks about the east wind, which is a stronger word. And that's a good study too, because the east wind is never a good thing in Scripture. Depending upon where you were, where we believe Job to be living, it would have come out of the desert, so it would have been very hot, very powerful, very unwelcome, especially during the summer months. There is nothing worse in the summer when you are sweltering than to have a hot breeze blowing on you. A cool breeze, kind of takes the moisture off the body and helps cool you, but not a hot breeze. A hot breeze just feels like you're in a blast furnace. I want to look at two quick examples of this. Go to Genesis chapter 41 and verse 6, and you'll get an idea of why he's using this in the context. In Genesis chapter 41 and verse 6, it says, this is Joseph's dreams here that he's interpreting for Pharaoh. It says, and behold, 7 thin ears and blasted with the east wind sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears, and Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Okay, the blasting of the east wind, Pharaoh knows this is not cool. And so he's all excited when he's thinking about the 7 fat cows, and then here come the 7 lean cows eat up the 7 fat cows, and he has 7 big fat ears of corn, but then you got these 7 lean ears of corn that have been blasted by the east wind, and they're going to eat them up. In other words, all of the prosperity that they're going to have for 7 years, by the time you get to the end of 14 years, it's all gone. And it's extension of what he's saying is this east wind is not good. When it blasts the corn, it's not going to grow. There's going to be big problems, and we can know from history that was a widespread drought that wasn't just in Egypt. It was all over the place because they traveled from the promised land down to Egypt to buy corn. You wouldn't go all the way to Egypt to buy corn if there was corn anywhere else in the area. And so that was a toughie. Go to Exodus chapter 10 and verse 13. Exodus chapter 10 and verse 13. You can tell what's going to happen here because we're in Exodus chapter 10. It's plague time. Verse 13 says, and Moses stretched forth his rod over the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought an east wind upon the land all that day and all that night, and when it was morning, the east wind brought the locusts. These people were not enjoying the east wind coming all day long and all night long, and they probably knew something bad was coming. It's that premonition that this is not good. You can tell that sometimes when storm starts rolling in. If there's a hurricane off the coast, all of a sudden the wind picks up, and the air smells differently and feels differently. The foreboding that is going on here, that's the picture that Eliphaz is painting to Job. He is very much telling him, you're going on and on and on, dude, and while you're talking, it's like a belly full of the east wind. There's just nothing really good that's coming out of what you are saying here. Storms in the eastern Mediterranean were famous. The Greeks called them the Euroclydon. You can read about that in Acts chapter 27, verse 14, and several others. again, when those things rolled through, nobody wanted to be out on the water. And if they were out on the water, they were either blown somewhere they didn't want to be or they were shipwrecked. And that's why there were certain times of the year when they did not travel, because those strong air currents spawned some awful, awful storms. That's what he's talking about here. So what he's really saying to Job here in verse 2 is, you got this empty talk of the wind, and actually it's a perfect storm or tempest of words, if you will, because you're boisterous and you're violent, but you're destructive in what you're saying, because God's going to hold you accountable for it sometime. Now, verse 3, will you argue your case with unprofitable talk? Boy, this hurts a little bit, because Job is wanting to talk to God, and he kept saying, I wish you'd show up and answer so that these boys would understand that I'm innocent. And now they've been listening to him talk to God, and they haven't interrupted him or said anything. They've just been listening to the conversation. And now Eliphaz is jumping in and saying, I can't believe that you would want to go before God and you don't have anything better than that to say. That's basically what he is saying. Your talk is disrespectful to your maker. Are you really sure that you want to have an audience with him? You're not speaking with reverence. You're speaking without reverence, Job. You act like you know God really well, but this useless, irreverent talk is not going to accomplish anything for you. Speeches that do no good. Using sound is what he is accusing him of instead of sense. In other words, what he's saying is, Job, you throw out all these big words and you propose all these big ideas, but there's really no substance to it. It's just a lot of yada, 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 with really nothing behind it at all. And there's no profit because it's not accomplishing anything. Basically, I don't know if you've ever heard this. Every once in a while, someone say, are you just talking to listen to the sound of your voice? That's kind of what Eliphaz is saying to him here. Hey, Job there, buddy, are you just talking to listen to the sound of your voice? Because I don't think you're accomplishing anything with God. Then in verse 4, he switches a little bit and he says, your words are dangerous. I'm in chapter 14. Here we go. Yea, thou castest all fear and restrainest prayer before God. Now, this is a very interesting little verse, because the danger lies in his attitude, and what they're accusing Job of his attitude, in the effect of what he's saying. His attitude, you have cast off fear. You have not shown any reverence or respect for God. How dare you treat God like a litigant in a court instead of a deity in heaven? That's the statement he's making here. He's just like right in Job's face saying, I don't like the disrespect that you are showing to God. And here's the problem. Now, this is what bothers Eliphaz. And you can tell the difference in what Job believes and what Eliphaz believes, because if Eliphaz were godly, it would bother Eliphaz by attacking the nature of God, which is not what Job did in the last chapter. And what he did is he attacked the religious system that says God has to reward those that are righteous and he has to punish those that are not. And so this statement that we have here, a restrainest prayer before God, in its effect, that word restrain means to shave off. And so in other words, what he's saying here is, the effect of what you're saying and what you're trying to get us to believe, Job, starts to shave belief in God away. That's literally what he's saying here. And here's the reason for it. If your view of God is right, then it would diminish the need to worship. And that's how you know that Eliphaz comes from humanistic thinking and man-made religion. The whole premise of the book of Job is that Job can be tested because his faith is genuine. That's the whole point of the book. And over and over and over again, the friends are coming at him, and this time they're saying, well, wait a second. Aren't you like shaving away at the need for us to worship God? If God can punish someone who is just and holy, That's not how man makes up religion. The system says God needs to reward the good and he needs to punish the evil, and that keeps people being good, and that keeps people going to church, and that keeps people asking for penance and giving offerings and burning candles and saying Hail Marys and, doing all these different things that man comes up with to try to feel better, because then God's not going to punish me. But Job, if what you're saying is true, that you are an innocent man and you're being punished, well then what's the point of religion? Man-made religion always says we worship gods, little g's, to appease the God, and so that they will either bless us or at the very least leave us alone. Nobody wants an antagonistic God that's throwing thunderbolts or sending windstorms or doing whatever. And so the whole basis of all the false religions that are circulating throughout history and will continue to is that I have to worship to appease a God, either that he will bless me or he's just going to leave me alone. Because if I don't try to do one of those two things, then the opposite, he's coming after me and he's going to make my life miserable. But if God sometimes punishes good people, or if God doesn't always punish evil people, then why be good at all? Why not just run around here and steal like everybody else is stealing and see if I can get away with it like they seem to be getting away with it? Verse 5 and 6, your words are self-justifying. The wrong motives is what he claims of him in verse 5. For thy mouth uttereth thine iniquity, and thou choosest the tongue of the crafty. You are attempting to justify yourself, but really what you're doing is you're adding to yourself blame. This is the old, if you can't have an argument with somebody, or you feel like you're losing the argument, then you psychoanalyze them and you say, you're only saying that because. This is Eliphaz going back to, I don't agree with what you say, but I can't prove otherwise, so I'm just going to attribute the wrong motive to you. And because you have the wrong motive, then what you say also has to be wrong. Now that isn't always true. You can say the right thing in the wrong way and hurt somebody's feelings. You can say the wrong thing in a right way and try and be real nice, but you didn't really help them because you gave them the wrong information. Anything but saying the right thing in the right way is detrimental. But the claim here, you pretend to reverence God while you are very craftily covering your sin. Now, in chapter 14, and they've heard him say some pretty good things about God. I know this about you, I know this about you, I know this about you. But now they are pretending that reverence is only so that everybody around goes, oh wow, Job really knows his God. Maybe he is innocent and he hasn't done anything because he really seems to know God well. The sophistication of your speech proves your guilt. Now isn't that interesting, because he started out verse 2 talking about vain wind and empty east wind. I mean, how do you start the conversation saying you have nothing to say, Job, you got nothing, and then 3 verses into it you're going to say you bring out all this sophisticated language just so people won't understand that really in your heart you're awful. And that's what they're accusing him of here. Also, an evil method, the tongue of the crafty. We understand that undeserved suffering is a mask, really, for a guilty conscience. We get what's happening here, Job. You keep telling us that you don't deserve this. You keep telling us that you don't know of anything. You keep saying, I wish God would show up and tell me what I did so I can confess it and make it right, when actually you just have a guilty conscience that's eating you up. But the basis of this statement, and this is a unique phrase here, the claim here is that the wisdom that Job is using is not from above. The wisdom Job is using is from below. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 1, it starts out and says, now, the serpent of the field was more what? Subtle. That's this word. See what he's saying? They are accusing Job while you say all this. And many times Jesus says that he is going to bring into account every idle word. But in Luke chapter 19, in verse 22, he says, "And he saith unto him, Out of thine own mouth will I judge thee, thou wicked servant. Thou knewest that I was an austere man, taking up that I laid not down, and reaping that I did not sow." This is from the passage of the hidden talents, where they are expected to do something profitable. And so you see, you have one of them coming back and saying, well, I didn't do anything with my talent. I just hit it in the ground because I thought you were this kind of an individual. And he says, I am going to judge you from the words of your own mouth. You just admitted what you think and know about the master, who is God. And so you did nothing for him because you didn't think he was worthy of doing anything. That's going to be the basis of your judgment. So it's not that we're saying here that Job isn't going to be held accountable for his words. That's not what I'm saying at all. But Eliphaz is jumping on this thing, and he's telling him, now listen, buddy, out of your own mouth, you keep saying these things, and do you realize that you are going to be held accountable for this? You are self-condemned. You keep going back to this courtroom setting and saying, boy, I wish I could call God to the witness stand, but I don't have any right to make him testify, and I don't have, what would I say if I were before him, because I'm a filthy, unclean person, and he's such a high and holy God. Now Eliphaz is saying, let's go back to that courtroom that you were in just a few minutes, Job, and let's have the court recorder read back to you what you said to God. Because you're going to be accountable for that, buddy. It proves you're guilty. It doesn't prove your innocence. Then in verses 7 through 10, your words are arrogant. I don't think anybody would like to be called arrogant, such a strong and harsh word. But that's what they're saying here. You're acting like the oldest and wisest man ever, in verse 7. Art thou the first man that was born, or wast thou made before the hills? In other words, who was the first man born? Adam. So what's Eliphaz asking him in his little smart aleck question? Well, he's asking him, are you older than Adam? Were you some special creation that happened before the pinnacle of creation, Adam, and then, of course, creating Eve from Adam's rib? Man was created so differently than any of the rest of the creation. Well, are you like even a step above that, Job? Were you some special creation even before God created Adam? Does your wisdom come from perfect creation? You see what he's saying? Because sin nature comes from Adam. So he's asking him, were you created before Adam? In other words, are you such a pure and sinless being that your knowledge has not been tainted ever by sin? Can you imagine talking to your friend like that? I mean, this is just not... Basically, he says, you talk like you've never sinned. That's a little strong. And then he says, were you created before the earth itself? Now, you look at somebody who is older and say, dude, you're older than the hills. You've heard that expression, right? Every once in a while, one of the little smart aleck kids up at school brings that out. You're older than the hills, because the hills are a symbol of creation itself. And so again, here's what he's saying. Are you a special of creation of God with information that we don't have? Because you were created before Adam, you were even created before he started creating the hills. Now, this is, let's go to Proverbs chapter 90 and verse 2, because you'll see how hateful and hurtful a statement this is. Proverbs 90, or Psalm 90 in verse 2. We're going to start in verse 1. Lord, thou hast been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever thou hadst formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. So what is Eliphaz saying to Job? Listen here, old boy. You think you're like God himself? Do you think you were created before creation was created? Do you think you were created before? And the words that he uses are used in Scripture to talk about God before creation. Now, let's take that and go to Proverbs chapter 8, because in Proverbs chapter 8, we're talking about wisdom. And obviously, wisdom is an extension of the one that wisdom comes from. Whole chapter is about it. We don't want to take the time to look at it tonight. But starting in verse 22 down through verse 29. This is talking about wisdom itself. The Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way before his works of old. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, or ever the earth was. Does that sound familiar from Job? When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no fountains abounding with water, before the mountains were settled, before the hills, so wisdom's older than the hills, was I brought forth. While as yet he had not made the earth, nor the fields, nor the highest part of the dust of the world, when he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he set a compass upon the face of the depth, when he established the clouds above, when he strengthened the fountains of the deep. When he gave to the sea his decree that the water should not pass his commandment, when he appointed the foundations of the earth. Listen, those verses are all talking about acts of creation in the first 6 days. And wisdom keeps saying, I was with God long before, long before, long before. And so Eliphaz is nastily and rhetorically asking Job, well, do you think you're like God himself because you were created before Adam and before the hills? And he's asking, do you think you are like the essence of wisdom itself? Because that's where wisdom comes from. He's not pulling punches in these sections at all. They are pouring it on, and sadly enough, as we proceed through each of the three friends, they're all going to get on it. Verses 8 through 10. Do you think you have a monopoly on wisdom, Job? Hast thou heard the secret of God? That word secret means counsel. And the Hebrew means the most intimate, confidential conversation with God. If we were to talk about this in government today, we would use the phrase special security clearance. Do they just allow anybody to walk into the White House and sit down in a meeting? You go to school board meeting up here, all you got to do is walk in the doors and sit down there in the auditorium and endure it. Right? That's it. It's open door. Nobody cares if you're there or not there. They're not taking roll. They're not checking your ID. Nobody's checking to see what kind of clearance you have. But if you were to go into a president's cabinet meeting, there are very few people that are allowed in a president's cabinet meeting. And so what they're asking them here is, hey, wait a minute, Job, do you think you're on God's cabinet? Do you think that you get to get in on the most intimate conversations that he has? Do you have information that the rest of us poor little lowlifes would never dare to dream of having? That's the assumption that's going on here. Romans 11:34 and 1 Corinthians 2:11 both say, we couldn't begin to understand the ways of God. It's not happening. This statement is, Job, you're like a soldier that's out of step, but claiming to be the only one in step. In other words, what they're saying is, you act like you're the final authority on everything. All three of us gave a speech, and you answered us as if we're ignorant and don't know anything. And then you act like you have this great relationship in chapter 14 with God. And I want to just tell you there, buddy, you're out of step with everybody else, and you're walking in step looking at us saying we need to get in step with you when everybody else is in step with us. In other words, we think we're the authority, you're not the authority. What do you know that we don't know in verse 9? What knowest thou that we know not? What understandest thou which is not in us? Is your intellect bigger than ours? Have you cultivated your intellect better than we have? What do you know that we are not aware of, is what he says in the second half of that verse. And the whole time I'm sitting here studying this and looking up these Hebrew words, I'm sitting at my desk going, ooh, I got a good one. Let me answer for Job. I'll tell you what Job has that none of his friends have. A proper view of God. Let's start there. Because all of these guys, they're just going on and on and on and on and on, acting like they're speaking on behalf of God, and they don't know anything about him. They know nothing about God. All they have is man-made humanism that says God has to do this and God has to do this. Let me tell you something. God doesn't have to do anything we think he has to do. That's why he's God and we're not. Do you outrank us in verse 10? Oh boy. 9 out of 10 dentists agree. So it has to be true. Look at what they say here. With us are both the gray-headed and very aged men, much elder than thy father. The people who think like us are the gray-headed ones. The people who hold our opinion are the old ones. And what he's doing here is, I didn't want to take the time tonight to look it up, but this has come up a couple of times before in the friends' arguments and in Job's rebuttal. And Job said, well, I'm not telling you that there isn't any wisdom in older people, and there isn't the wisdom of the ages. But that's what Eliphaz is doing here. He is appealing to the aged men, and he is appealing to the wisdom of the ages. In other words, he's saying, Job, I have timeless truths, and I don't care how much you argue and how big a word you use and how much you claim to know God, you're not going to change my mind on these timeless truths. But let me read this to you another way. There was one translation that read it like this. And while I don't know that you can accurately decipher the Hebrew in this way, it does give you a meaning that is important. Verse 10 could very well read, Eliphaz, the hoary-headed, in other words, the gray-haired, Bildad, the long-lived, and Zophar, who is older than your dad, say. See what they're doing? You claim to have this great relationship with God, Job, and you're going on and on and on and on, and it's like a bag of hot air, and it's like the east wind. It's just destructive in what you're saying. And then they go down through, and you're arrogant, and you're, self-appeasing here, and you're saying all these things, and you think you're better than us. Do you think you outrank us? In other words, who do you think you're talking to, buddy? I am older than you. Bildad's older than you. Zophar might be older than your dad. You take all of the wisdom of the ages, but here's the problem with this statement. And it's the problem the three friends have all along. If you are wrong at the beginning of something, all you do is get more wrong as you go farther along. If your starting point is wrong, you don't get closer to the truth out here. You get farther and farther away from it. Point in case. Example. If you believe that the world started from a Big Bang theory and evolution is true, then everything from that starting point forward, it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. But if you understand that God created the world, then all of the things along the way that come down through here drastically changes the way you view the world because of that one statement. And so what these boys are saying here is, we have the wisdom of the ages. Listen, if it's humanism, if it's man-made wisdom, I don't care how old it is. Because they have been worshiping Baal for thousands and thousands of years, but it still doesn't make it right. I don't care how many years Jesus tarries, the Roman Catholic Church is not going to be right in thinking that the Pope's words are equal with God's words. Ain't going to happen. I don't care how many people say it. I don't care how popular it becomes. I don't care if it's a thing on social media. Just because it's popular, just because it's old school, does not make it right. You want to talk about the wisdom of the ages? Let's go to the book from the timeless one, from everlasting to everlasting. And let's see what he has to say about it. Because that's the desire of Job's heart. I wish God would weigh in on this and just tell me the truth so I could understand why all this suffering. Man, wouldn't it be so much easier on Job if he knew why he was going through it all? It's amazing to me that we don't get a why for quite a few more chapters yet. All right, Junior IT, will you hit the stop button? You got it? Is he back there? I thought I saw his head a minute ago. Junior IT's asleep at the computer, probably.